She didn't know his name. All she knew was that he was going to die. The boy couldn't have been more than 6 years old, his little feet bleeding as he scrambled over the frozen ground. He was backing away, stumbling toward an old oak tree, his eyes wide with a terror so pure it stole the air from her lungs. Staring him down were 2 timber wolves, gray ghosts against the snow, their shoulders low, their lips peeled back from yellowed teeth. They had already decided he was their next meal. And in that split second, Marble didn't think. She didn't weigh the odds. She didn't consider her own life. She just opened her mouth and screamed, a raw, primal sound that ripped from her soul, and she ran straight for them. She charged into the clearing, arms flung wide, her heart hammering against her ribs like a war drum. The world narrowed to a single point of focus, the space between the beasts and the boy. The wolves whipped their heads around, startled by the sudden madness of this lone woman. One of them let out a low, guttural snarl and began to pad forward, its body coiled like a spring. The other one didn't hesitate. It lunged. Marble snatched the nearest dead branch from the ground without breaking stride. It was heavy, solid. She swung it with all the force of her desperation, a wild, arcing blow that connected with a sickening crack against the side of the lunging wolf's jaw. The animal yelped, a high-pitched sound of pain and surprise, and it spun away, disappearing into the undergrowth. But the second wolf was smarter. It didn't charge, it circled. It moved to get behind her, its teeth bared, its eyes locked on her. She instinctively stepped back, placing her body squarely in front of the little boy. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the branch. Her body was rigid, not with courage, but with a terrifying, absolute certainty. She was not brave, she was just a wall. And something deep inside her, something she didn't know she had, refused to let this child die alone in the cold. The wolf hesitated. It took another step, then stopped. It looked at her, at the raw fury in her eyes, at the impossible defiance of her stance. It looked past her, at the boy cowering by the tree, and then, as if it had seen something else entirely, something bigger and more dangerous in her than she had ever seen in herself, it turned, and just like the first one, it vanished into the trees like a wisp of smoke. The woods fell silent. The only sound was the ragged gasping of her own breath, sucking in the frigid air. Her chest heaved. Blood, warm and sticky, dripped from a long scratch on her arm. She stood there for a long moment, waiting for her heart to slow down, waiting for the world to feel real again. When she finally turned around, the boy was gone. He had vanished just as silently as the wolves. No thank you, no words, not even a backwards glance. He had slipped away the very instant the danger passed, leaving her alone in the chilling stillness of the woods. She was left standing there, trembling, holding a broken branch, wondering if any of it had even mattered. But she knew it had happened. The proof was in the blood on her arm and the ache in her bones. She limped back into town, her dress torn, her hand wrapped in a piece of her apron. The first person she saw was the butcher's wife, a woman with a face like a sour plum. The woman's eyes raked over Marble's disheveled state, and a cruel little smirk played on her lips. "Looks like you got into a fight with the devil himself, Marble," she said, her voice loud enough for others to hear. Marble's voice was barely a whisper. "I saved a child," she said, leaning against the doorframe of the general store. "A Comanche boy. He was surrounded by wolves." The butcher's wife stared at her for a moment, the smirk widening into a look of open disbelief. Then she laughed. It was not a kind sound. "Is that so?" she sneered. That was all it took. By nightfall, the story had spread through the town like a sickness. But it wasn't her story, it was theirs. They said she'd gone looking for trouble with the Indians. They said she'd made the whole thing up for attention, the lonely spinster desperate for a bit of drama. They said she was losing her mind. No one believed her. No one even cared to ask if she was all right. The town wrapped its judgment around her like a shroud, and she was alone again. More alone than she had been in the woods, facing down the wolves. For 2 days, she stayed inside her small, cold cabin at the edge of town, tending to her scratches and the deeper wounds of their scorn. She began to wonder if maybe they were right. Maybe the cold and the loneliness had finally made her see things. Maybe the boy, the wolves, her own sudden, impossible courage. Maybe it was all a dream. But on the 3rd night, just before the gray light of dawn, she heard a sound, a soft scrape on her wooden porch step. Her heart leaped into her throat. She held her breath, listening. Silence. Had she imagined it? Was her mind playing tricks again? Slowly, carefully, she unbolted the door and pulled it open just a crack. And there, lying gently on the top step, was something that made the world stand still. A small, carved wooden doll. Its eyes were wide and round, staring up at the sky. Its hands were painted with a stark, bright red paint. She stared at it, frozen. It hadn't been dropped. It hadn't been tossed there. It had been placed with care. He remembered. The boy. He had come back. And a new, colder fear washed over her. If he had found her home, then it meant someone else would be coming too. Marble didn't touch it at first. The little wooden doll sat there on the step, a silent messenger in the pre-dawn gloom. Its arms were painted a shocking blood red. Its legs were carved with tiny, careful notches, a pattern she didn't understand. And its eyes, round and dark, seemed to be looking right through her, up at the heavens, just like the boys had in the woods. She crouched down slowly, her joints protesting the cold. With both hands, she reached out and lifted it. The doll was heavier than it looked. It was real, solid. It was proof. Not just proof of the wolves, or the danger, or the fight. It was proof of memory. He had remembered her. He had tracked her. He had found her doorstep in the dark. She hadn't told a single soul in this town where she lived, tucked away at the very edge of the woods. But now, he knew, and that meant his people knew. She brought the doll inside and placed it on her small, rickety table. For the rest of the day, she barely moved. The doll sat there, staring at the door, an unblinking sentinel. Her stomach twisted itself into knots. She couldn't eat. Her thoughts circled endlessly, like buzzards over a carcass. What did it mean? Was it a gift? A warning? A threat? When dusk fell and the world outside her cabin went quiet, she locked every bolt, drew every worn curtain, and sat in the dark, listening, waiting. She was no longer afraid of the town's judgment. She was afraid of what lay beyond the town. By the next morning, the town had already forgotten her supposed tall tale. They hadn't forgiven her. They had simply erased her. At the bakery, the young girl at the counter saw her coming and immediately turned her back, busying herself with rearranging loaves that were already perfectly arranged. At the public water pump, a man who had known her for years let the heavy handle fall with a clang rather than pass it to her. He walked away without a word. She didn't fight it. She didn't have the energy. She was too busy listening for a sound that wasn't the wind in the pines or the creak of her own cabin walls. She was listening for hoofbeats. They came on the 3rd morning, just as the sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon. She heard them before she saw them. It wasn't the frantic gallop of a raid. It was a slow, rhythmic, deliberate thump. A procession. It was the sound of purpose. Her heart stopped. Her fingers went numb. She crept to the window and pulled the curtain back just a sliver. And there they were. 3 Comanche riders sat on their horses at the edge of her small, untended yard. They were silent. Perfectly still. Statues carved from the morning mist. Their presence was overwhelming, a silent weight that pressed down on the very air. In the center was a man who seemed to be the heart of that stillness. His hair was long and black, tied back with a simple strip of rawhide. His face was weathered, stern, his eyes as dark and deep as tree bark after a long rain. He wasn't looking at the cabin. He was looking straight at her window, as if he could see her hiding there in the shadows. Then he dismounted. Her fingers tightened on the frayed edge of the curtain until her knuckles were white. He was coming. He moved with a grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. He didn't knock. He didn't shout. He walked right up to her porch, his moccasins making no sound on the frosted dirt. He stood there for a moment, still and silent, and then he reached into a leather pouch at his belt. He pulled something out, something wrapped in a piece of brilliant blue cloth, and placed it gently on the step right beside her door. Then he turned and walked back toward his horse. But before he mounted, he stopped. He looked over his shoulder, his gaze finding her window again, and he spoke. His voice was calm, clear, and carried easily in the crisp morning air. "You saved my son." The words hit her like a physical blow. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. "Now I ask," he continued, his voice unwavering, "may I speak to the woman who was brave when no one else was?" The door opened slowly, creaking on its rusted hinges. Marble's hand was still resting on the frame, as if the weight of her own body was too much to bear, and she needed something to hold her upright. At her feet, the small package wrapped in brilliant blue cloth was a splash of impossible color against the drab wood of her porch. She knelt down, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the corners. Inside was not a weapon, not a warning, but a small, fragrant bundle of dried herbs, a tightly coiled strip of tanned leather, and a single, perfect eagle feather, its edges clean and sharp. It wasn't a random gift. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was a message. Each item had a meaning she couldn't yet understand. She stepped outside, the frozen boards of the porch seeping a brutal cold into her bare feet, but she didn't feel it. She didn't feel anything but the force of his gaze. Her eyes were locked on the man who now stood patiently beside his horse, his expression steady, waiting. It was not a hard look, but it held an intensity that stripped away all pretense. She had no words. What could she possibly say? So she just gave a single, small nod. It was enough. He walked back toward her, his steps slow and measured, moving with a kind of deep respect, as if he were approaching a sacred place. He stopped a few feet away, not wanting to crowd her, to intimidate her. He bowed his head slightly. "My name is Tawa," he said. The silence that followed stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions, but it didn't feel empty or awkward. It felt heavy, ancient. She waited. She knew he had more to say. 3 winters ago, he began, his voice low and even but carrying a history of pain. "My wife died. She died protecting our son from a river that tried to steal him. She held his head above the water until her own strength gave out, and the river took her instead." His voice didn't break, but something inside of it, some core of strength, seemed to fold in on itself for a moment. He took a breath. "Since that day, my son has not spoken. Not a word, not a sound. The healers said his spirit had hidden itself away where the grief could not find it. He has not spoken a full sentence until 2 days ago." Tawa lifted his eyes and met hers directly. "He came back to our camp, shaking, covered in mud, and he told me, 'The wolf came, but Mama didn't run. She came toward the wolves.'" Marble's breath hitched in her throat. Her heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of her chest. "Mama." He had called her Mama. Tawa looked at her then, not with pity, not with a sense of debt, but with a strange and powerful kind of reverence. "In our way," he said, "a person who saves a child becomes family, not by blood, but by the joining of souls. You are now bound to him. My people, they wish to meet you, to thank you, I came to ask if you would come to our camp, only for a day." She didn't know what to say. No one in her world had asked anything of her in months, except to be silent, to be invisible. And now this man, this stranger, a man whose people had every reason to hate and mistrust hers, was offering her, what? Acceptance? Honor? It was something she couldn't name, but she knew with a desperate, aching certainty that she wanted it. "I don't know if I belong there," she whispered, the words tasting like dust and doubt. "Maybe not," Tawa said, his voice softening. "But my son has already chosen you, and in our world that makes you something more than a stranger. It makes you an answer to a prayer." The old porch creaked beneath her bare feet. She glanced back over her shoulder at her empty cabin, at the broken chair in the corner, the few forgotten books on a shelf, the lingering ghost of loneliness. Then she looked at the man and the waiting horse, and the untamed trail that led away from everything she knew. "I'll come," she said, her voice so quiet she barely heard it herself. "Just for the day." Tawa nodded, a flicker of relief in his dark eyes. "That is all I ask." The ride was silent, but it was a silence filled with meaning. Tawa didn't try to fill the air with small talk, and Marble had no words to offer. It wasn't the silence of strangers. It was older, deeper. It was the kind of quiet you find in ancient places, the kind you know not to break for fear of shattering something sacred. The trail wound through narrow, rocky passes and up steep ridgelines that suddenly opened into vast, sweeping plains. She had lived near this land her whole life, but she had never truly seen it. Not like this. Unclaimed, unscarred, breathing softly with the wind. As they approached the edge of the Comanche encampment, a cluster of hide-covered lodges nestled in a protective curve of the river, a small boy darted out from behind one of the dwellings. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw them, his eyes going wide. It was him, the child from the woods. He didn't speak. He just stared, his mouth slightly open, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real, that she had actually come. Then, slowly, hesitantly, he walked toward the horse she was riding. He reached up a small, steady hand and gently placed it on her knee. A simple touch, an anchor. Tawa dismounted first, then turned and offered his hands to help her down. As her feet touched the ground, she braced herself. She didn't know what to expect. Suspicion? Hostility? A camp full of stern-faced warriors like the two who had ridden with Tawa? But what greeted her was not what she expected at all. 3 women stepped forward. They were older, their long, graying hair in thick braids, their faces lined with the kind of wisdom that comes from witnessing both storms and sunrises. They moved together, a silent delegation of matriarchs. One of them, the eldest, reached out a gentle, wrinkled hand and touched Marble's cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. That was all. No questions, no doubts, no accusations, just a simple, profound recognition that warmed her in a way she hadn't felt in years. She was seen. They led her toward the central fire, where the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat. They offered her food she didn't know the name of, served in a carved wooden bowl. They sat with her, not as if she was a white woman, an outsider, a strange and lonely creature from another world. They sat with her as if she was something that had been missing from their circle, and had now, finally, returned. The boy, whose name she learned was Sonny, sat close to her. He never touched her again, but he was always there, a small, watchful presence at her side. Tawa didn't hover. He gave her space to breathe, to observe, to simply be. She saw him speaking quietly with some of the elders, saw him share a rare, quick smile with a young rider who brought back buckets of water from the river. He was a leader here. He was part of this place, woven into its fabric. And for today, somehow, she was too. As the sky began to bleed from blue to a fiery orange, the oldest woman by the fire, the one who had first touched her cheek, looked at Marble with her dark, knowing eyes. "In our way," the old woman said, her voice resonating with ancient authority. "A child who chooses is listened to. His spirit is clear. He has not been clouded by the lies of the world. He chose you." Marble's throat tightened. She had spent a lifetime trying to be chosen, by men who found her too plain, by employers who found her too quiet, by a town that had always looked at her and said, "Not quite, not one of us." And now, a silent boy she barely knew had undone all of that with a single, terrified look in the woods. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know if she would ever see these people or this place again. But as the fire crackled, and Sonny, finally feeling safe, leaned his small head against her arm, Marble felt a shift deep within her soul. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel borrowed, or temporary, or out of place. She felt placed. But as she looked around the fire, she noticed one person who wasn't smiling. An old warrior, his face a mask of scars and suspicion, sat across the circle, his arms crossed over his chest. His eyes, hard as flint, were fixed on her. He had not welcomed her. He had not spoken. He just watched her, his gaze a cold weight in the warm glow of the fire. And she knew with a sudden chill that not everyone here had chosen her. She didn't sleep that night. Not from fear, but from a profound and unsettling newness. The lodge they gave her was small, made of thick, taut buffalo hides stretched over a frame of willow poles, but it held the warmth of the day's sun like a cradle. Outside, she could hear the gentle, rhythmic thumping of a distant drum, the soft murmur of voices, and the steady, reassuring sound of horses moving along the perimeter of the camp. It wasn't the sound of a threat. It was the sound of a community breathing. It didn't feel foreign. It felt like a place she had once dreamed about and long since forgotten. At dawn, she pushed aside the hide flap of her lodge and stepped out into the crisp air. Sonny was already there, waiting for her beside the glowing embers of the central fire. He was holding something in his hands. It was the doll, the same one he had left on her porch. But something was different. Tied around its small wooden waist was a new strip of leather, a tiny sash painted with a pattern of delicate blue dots. She knelt in front of him, the cold ground seeping through the thin fabric of her dress. Did you make this for me?" she asked softly. He gave a slow, solemn nod. Then, with infinite care, he reached out and touched the back of her wrist with a single finger. The touch was as light as a moth's wing. "I remember," he said. 2 words, just 2 words, but they struck her with the force of a thunderclap. Her eyes stung with sudden unshed tears. He hadn't spoken to her before, not when she'd faced the wolves, not when he'd placed his hand on her knee, but now he had spoken directly to her. He remembered. Unsure what else to do, she simply sat down on the ground beside him. She didn't need to say anything. He leaned his small body into her side, resting his head against her shoulder. The warmth of him, the quiet trust, it was an answer to a question she hadn't even known how to ask. Across the fire, Tawa watched them, a still and silent observer. He didn't interrupt the moment, but she felt his gaze, and she also saw the old, scarred warrior from the night before, Stonehand, watching Tawa. He said something to Tawa, his voice a low growl, and gestured toward her with his chin. Tawa shook his head firmly, his expression unyielding. There was a tension here, a conflict she stood at the center of. When Tawa finally approached, he was carrying something wrapped in hide. He offered it to her with both hands, a gesture of formal respect. She took it, her fingers brushing his. She unwrapped the hide and gasped. Inside was a bracelet. It was made of bone beads, polished smooth, interspersed with chips of brilliant blue turquoise and pieces of intricately carved wood, all strung together on braided sinew. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It felt ancient, ceremonial, important. This is too much, she whispered, her voice thick. I'm no one. Tawa shook his head, his dark eyes intense. You are the reason my son speaks again, he said quietly. You are the only one he listens to. In the eyes of my people, in the eyes of my son, you have already been accepted. He paused, and his gaze flickered toward Stone Hand, who was now pointedly sharpening a knife by the fire. Most of my people, he corrected himself. The question slipped out before she could stop it, raw and unplanned. What about you? He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. I did not come to you to repay a debt, he said, his voice low and certain. I came because my son's spirit recognized yours. I came because I believe there is a great power between people who do not look away from fear. His words weren't a declaration of love, not in the way her world understood it. They were something deeper, something rooted in respect and spiritual awe. She looked down at the beautiful, heavy bracelet. Then she looked at Sonny's face, now calm and peaceful as he rested against her. For the first time in her entire life, belonging didn't feel like something she had to desperately fight for or earn. It felt like something she had already, unknowingly, become. But as she slipped the bracelet onto her wrist, she saw Stone Hand watch the motion, and his eyes narrowed. He spat on the ground, turned his back on them, and walked away. The message was clear. She may have been accepted by the son and by the father, but she was not welcome here, not by everyone. And that made the ground beneath her feet feel dangerously unstable. The next morning, Tawa offered to ride with her back to the edge of town. It was time to go. But as she moved toward the horse, it was Sonny who stopped her. He stood directly in her path, his small hands gripping the hem of her worn dress, just as a child would with his own mother. I'll be back, she whispered, crouching down to look him in the eye. But his face was a mask of despair. He didn't nod. He didn't believe her, and she wasn't sure if she believed herself. Tawa placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. Let her go, little one, he said, his voice soft but firm. Sonny looked up at his father, then back at her. Without another sound, he turned and walked away, his little shoulders slumped. The weight of his silent departure followed her all the way down the trail, a heavier burden than she had ever carried. Back in her own world, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The same suspicious glances followed her down the main street. The same doors closed quietly as she approached. But something inside of her was different. She didn't shrink. She didn't feel smaller than their petty gossip. She walked through the street like someone who belonged to something bigger, something they couldn't see or understand. The bracelet on her wrist was a secret, a hidden strength. She stopped by the bleak town orphanage and left a basket with the bread and apples she'd bought. She didn't announce herself, just left it on the step and walked away. Then she went home. The cabin hadn't moved. The cracked mirror on the wall was still cracked. The loose floorboard by the hearth still groaned under her weight. But the emptiness inside the small room didn't feel like a curse anymore. It felt like space. And she knew now that space could be filled. That night, she couldn't sleep. It wasn't Tawa she missed, not his quiet strength or his intense gaze. It was the boy. She missed the feel of his small hand tugging on her skirt. She missed his silent, watchful presence, the way he just was, without any demands or expectations. She missed the solid weight of him leaning against her. She stared at the bracelet on her bedside table. The carved bone caught the moonlight, and it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a connection to the world she had just left behind. In the morning, she didn't hide. She walked directly to the general store, not to beg for her job back, but to buy supplies. Fine cotton fabric, buttons made of polished shell, and strong, dark thread. She spent the entire day working, her fingers growing sore as she cut and stitched. And when she was finally done, she held it up. It was a small shirt, perfectly made. She folded it carefully, wrapped it in simple brown paper, and tied it with the very leather cord that Sunny had used for the doll's sash. Then she waited for the sun to set. As twilight settled over the town, she walked out to the edge of the woods, to the exact spot where her property ended and the wild land began. She placed the small package on a large flat rock. She didn't wait. She didn't look around to see if anyone was watching. She just left her message there, turned around, and walked home. But the next morning, just after sunrise, there was a knock at her door. It wasn't the hard, demanding rap of a townsman. It was two soft, hesitant taps. Her heart hammered in her chest. She pulled the door open, and there he was. Sunny stood on her porch wearing the new shirt. His dark hair was neatly braided, and he clutched the worn wooden doll in one hand. In his other hand, he held something out to her. It was another bracelet, wrapped in hide. This one was smaller, child-sized. He looked up at her, his dark eyes serious and full of a meaning that made her knees weak. "Now we match," he said. A wave of pure terror washed over her. She didn't ask who had brought him. She didn't see Tawa or any horses. Had he walked here, alone, through miles of wilderness? The thought was paralyzing. This small boy had crossed a dangerous world to find his way back to her door. It didn't matter. He was here. He was safe. He had come home. She ushered him inside, not with frantic questions, but with a wave of overwhelming warmth. She set a place for him at her table, poured him a cup of water, and gently washed the dust of the trail from his small, determined hands. He said very little, simply sat close to her, his doll in his lap, the matching bracelet now snug around his wrist. He was home. It was as simple and as profound as that. When he finished the piece of bread she gave him, he crawled into her lap and laid his head down, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, something he had done 1,000 times before. Marble stroked his soft hair and felt a knot of tension she had carried for years finally begin to unwind. It wasn't relief. It was something gentler. It was presence. Later that evening, as darkness fell, another knock came. This one was different, firmer. She knew, before she even opened the door, that it would be Tawa. He stood there in the twilight, tall and quiet, his silhouette framed by the last purple glow of the sky. His eyes searched hers, not for permission, not with anger, but for understanding. "He left before I could stop him," Tawa said, his voice a low rumble. "I followed his tracks. I am not here to take him back." Marble nodded slowly, her hand still curled around the door frame. She looked from the father to the sleeping son in her cabin. "He's not lost," she said softly. "He's just home." Tawa stepped forward then, not as a warrior, not as a chief, but simply as a father. He walked past her into the cabin. Sunny stirred, saw him, and ran to meet him, clutching his doll. Tawa knelt, placed both of his large hands on his son's shoulders, and pressed his forehead to the boy's. It was a silent, sacred communion. Then he stood, and his eyes, full of a deep and unsettling emotion, found Marble's. "You have done more than save his life," he said, his voice thick with a feeling she couldn't name. "You have made him remember what safe feels like." She looked down, overwhelmed, unsure how to hold the weight of his words. The next ones tumbled out of her own mouth before she even knew she was going to say them. "You can both stay," she offered, her voice rushing. "If you want. If you'd rather not ride back in the dark." He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, then at his son, who was now leaning sleepily against his leg, and then at the fading light outside the open door. A silent battle seemed to play out behind his eyes. Finally, he spoke. "He has already stayed," he said simply. "I would only be catching up." That night, the three of them sat by her small, crackling fireplace. There was no ceremony. There were no promises made. There was just a shared, comfortable silence and the quiet snap of the burning wood. It didn't feel like a beginning, and it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like something in between. It felt like a story that neither of them had ever dared to write was finally finding its first pages. But as they sat there, a family forged in fire and fear, she couldn't shake the feeling that the town was watching, waiting. And the peace she felt was as fragile as a pane of glass in a hailstorm. The next few days passed in a strange, unspoken rhythm. Tawa didn't ask for permission to stay. He simply began to exist there. He rose before the sun each morning and disappeared into the woods, returning with firewood or strange, fragrant herbs she didn't recognize, or sometimes a rabbit for their stew. In the evenings, when Sunny was asleep, he would sit by the fire and carve small, intricate figures from pieces of wood: a bird, a wolf, a running horse. Marble didn't ask him about his past, and he never pressed her about hers. They moved around each other in the small cabin, sharing space not out of duty or obligation, but out of a quiet, mutual choice. Each moment was simple, real, and utterly profound, until the town noticed. It started with the glances again, but they were different now. Sharper, more venomous. When Marble walked to the market with Sunny holding her hand, people didn't just ignore her. They crossed the street to avoid her. When Tawa followed a few paces behind them, a silent, protective shadow, no one dared to speak, but every single eye in that town tracked him like he was a lit fuse on a powder keg. One afternoon, the preacher's wife, Mrs. Gable, knocked on her door. "Just thought I'd pay a friendly visit," she said, her smile as bright and false as a lead coin. Once inside, her eyes darted everywhere, lingering on the Comanche bracelet on Marble's wrist, the eagle feather Tawa had tucked beside the doorframe, the second plate and cup sitting on the table. "We all want you to be happy, Marble," Mrs. Gable said, her voice dropping to a low, sugar-slick whisper. "We truly do. But there are proper ways to find companionship, ways that won't confuse people or put yourself in danger." Marble didn't reply. She didn't defend herself. She simply walked to the door, opened it wide, and stood beside it, her silence more powerful than any argument. Mrs. Gable's fake smile faltered. She gathered her shawl and her indignation and swept out of the cabin. That night, Marble found Tawa outside, sitting on a log, sharpening a hunting blade with a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was a calming sound. She sat beside him, watching the sparks fly up into the darkness. "They think I should be ashamed," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He paused, looking over at her, his face illuminated by the moonlight. "Are you?" "Not of you," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Never of you. I'm just ashamed of how long it took me to stop needing their approval." He nodded slowly, then set the blade and the stone down beside him. "Where I am from," he said, his voice deep and steady, "shame does not belong to those who are loved. Shame belongs to those who do not protect what is sacred. They should be ashamed, Marble, not you." Just then, the cabin door creaked open and Sunny peered out, a wool blanket clutched in his hand, his face soft with sleep. He padded over to Marble and crawled into her lap, his eyes closing almost before he'd even settled. He trusted her completely. Marble looked down at the sleeping boy, at the way his small body fit so perfectly against hers. "Do you think he understands any of this?" she asked Tawa. "What it all means?" Tawa nodded. "Children do not need to understand everything, but they always know who their people are." She looked up from the boy to the man, her heart fuller than she could ever remember it being. A feeling of fierce, protective love washed over her. "Then maybe I do too," she whispered. The morning came with a layer of frost on the window pane and a deep quiet in the house. Tawa had already gone out, likely checking his snares in the woods. Sonny sat at the small table, carefully arranging his doll and a collection of smooth stones into a silent story. Marble poured some water into a small tin cup and slid it gently across the table to him. "Do you want some honey in your water today?" she asked. He nodded, then placed the doll down very deliberately. He looked at her, his gaze steady and serious, longer than he usually did. It felt like he was studying the lines on her face, the way her hair fell, making some kind of deep and final decision. She smiled at his intensity and turned to get the honey jar from the pantry shelf. And that's when he said it. Just one word. Spoken so softly, yet it filled the entire cabin, the entire world. It was quiet, but it was full, and it was clear as a bell. "Mama." She froze. Her hand hovered over the jar. Her heart didn't just stop, it felt like it ceased to exist for a second. The world tilted on its axis. "What? What did you say, sweet boy?" she whispered, afraid to turn around, afraid the sound had been a trick of her own yearning heart. He stood up from his chair, walked across the floor to her side, and slipped his small, warm fingers into her hand. "You're my mama," he said again, not as a question, but as a simple statement of fact. A truth that had been waiting for the right moment to finally take a breath and be spoken aloud. She turned then and knelt down, her whole body trembling. She wrapped her arms around him and hugged him tight, the kind of hug that doesn't just offer comfort, but closes a wound that no one else in the world had ever seen. She didn't cry. She couldn't. Instead, she felt something leave her body, a cold, heavy ghost she had been carrying for years. The fear that she was unworthy, the fear that she hadn't earned this. It was gone. Later that afternoon, she sat on the porch step, sewing a soft new leather satchel for Sonny to carry his doll and his collection of treasures. As she pushed the needle through the supple hide, the town schoolteacher, Mr. Rowan, a man she'd always considered decent, rode up on his horse. He tipped his hat, his face grim. "Word travels fast in a town this small, Marble," he said without preamble. "People are saying, they're saying the boy called you mother." She didn't look up from her stitching. He did. "And you're keeping him then?" he pressed. "You're intending to raise him?" "I'm not keeping anyone, Mr. Rowan," she said calmly, her voice even. She pulled the thread taut. "I've just been found." Mr. Rowan sat on his horse, looking down at her for a long, silent moment. "This is not the way our people would choose to make a family, Marble. It's not right." "No," she said, threading her needle again. She finally looked up, and her gaze was as clear and steady as a winter sky. "But I don't think I'm here to be chosen by your people anymore." That evening, Tawa returned from the woods with a quiet smile and a brace of rabbits. He saw the new satchel she had made. He saw the way Sonny now rested in her lap, as if he had been born there. He saw the new light in her eyes. And he knew. He simply sat down beside her by the fire and said nothing. He didn't need to. The boy had named her, and that name was a bond. It was a foundation stone that no town, no preacher, no rumor could ever shake loose or wear away. She belonged now, not to a place, but to a people, to herself, to this boy, and perhaps to something even deeper than family. She belonged to a story that had finally, after a lifetime of waiting, given her a place to begin. Spring came slowly that year, as if the land itself wasn't sure it could trust the warmth to stay. The hills turned green in quiet, hesitant patches. The trees blinked awake, one pale blossom at a time. And on the first morning that came without a trace of frost, Marble stood at the edge of the woods. Sonny stood beside her, his hand held firmly in hers. Tawa stood just behind them, a silent, watchful guardian. In her hands, Marble held a small cedar box. Tawa had carved it for her, and she had spent the evening smoothing it with oil until it shone. Inside, she had placed the three things that had rewritten her life: the heavy bone and turquoise bracelet, the small leather sash from the doll, and a faded, torn scrap from her old apron, the one stained with her own blood from the day she faced the wolves. "I thought I should throw it all away," she whispered to the quiet woods. "Burn it. Let the past go." Tawa stepped forward, his voice low and gentle. "Or you can plant it." She looked at him, surprised. He handed her a small spade he had brought. Together, the three of them found a small, sun-dappled clearing near an old sycamore tree, where the soil was soft and dark. Marble dug a narrow trench, the earth yielding easily. She laid the cedar box inside, a coffin for her old life, a seed for her new one. She pushed the dirt back over it with her hands. Sonny knelt beside her, pressed his small palm firmly into the freshly turned earth, and left a perfect handprint. He looked up at her, his face serious. "Now it can grow," he said, "into something better." She kissed the top of his head, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. For the first time, she felt she had truly given something back to the world. She hadn't just saved a life, she had become a part of one, but their peace was about to be shattered. That night, as she cooked cornbread on the hearth and Tawa carved a new spoon for the boy, a loud, angry pounding shook the cabin door. It wasn't a knock, it was a demand. Sonny jumped, startled, and ran to hide behind Marble's skirts. Tawa was on his feet in an instant, his body tense, his hand moving instinctively toward the knife at his belt. "Marble, open this door!" a voice boomed from outside. It was the preacher. Marble's blood ran cold. She looked at Tawa, her eyes wide with fear. He gave a single sharp nod. "Stay calm." She opened the door to find not just the preacher, Mr. Gable, but the schoolteacher, Mr. Rowan, and 3 other grim-faced townsmen holding lanterns. Their faces were hard, set with self-righteous fury. "We're here to save you, Marble," the preacher declared, his eyes fixing on Tawa, who now stood protectively in the center of the room. "We will not stand by while you are held captive by this savage." "I am not a captive," Marble said, her voice shaking but firm. "You are confused, child," Mr. Rowan said. His earlier decency vanished, replaced by a stern paternalism. "You will come with us. Now. We will take the boy to the orphanage where he belongs." 2 of the men started to step forward, their hands reaching for her, and then Tawa moved. He didn't draw his knife. He didn't raise his voice. He simply took 1 step forward, placing himself between Marble and the men. The air in the room crackled with sudden, lethal tension. "You will not touch her," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried an authority that stopped the men dead in their tracks. It was the voice of a man who knew 100 ways to kill and needed none of them. "This is not your concern, Indian," the preacher snarled. "This is town business. God's business." Tawa's eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. "This woman," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm, "and this boy are under the protection of my people. This cabin does not stand in your town. It stands on the edge of our lands, according to the treaty your own leaders signed. By stepping over that threshold with threats, you are not on your land anymore. You are on ours." The men froze. Their bravado evaporated, replaced by a sudden dawning fear. They were farmers and shopkeepers. They were not warriors. They had forgotten in their arrogance where the town ended and where the wild, untamed world began. "You have no power here, preacher," Tawa continued, his gaze like chips of ice. "Take your God and your judgment and go, and do not come back." For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. Then the preacher, his face pale and sweating in the lantern light, took a stumbling step backward. The other men followed, their mission of salvation turning into a hasty, shuffling retreat. They fled from the cabin, disappearing into the darkness they had come from. The door closed, shutting out the night and the hatred. The silence that filled the cabin was profound. It was the silence of victory, the silence of safety. Tawa turned to her. His face was still hard, but his eyes had softened. He looked at her, then at the boy peeking out from behind her skirts. She knelt down and pulled Sonny into her arms, burying her face in his hair. She was safe. She wasn't just loved, she was defended. She had a family, she had a protector, she had a home. Tawa came and sat with them by the fire, wrapping a strong arm around them both. He lifted his hand and gently touched her cheek. "My people have a name," he said softly, "for one who does not run from fear, but walks into it to protect another. The name is the one who returns fire with open hands." She smiled through her tears. "That sounds far too grand for me." "It is the name my son gave you," he replied, "and if you will allow it, it will be the name you carry among us for all our days." She didn't need to think. She didn't need to hesitate. She looked from the man who had defended her to the child who had chosen her. "Then let it be my name," she whispered. Outside, a soft wind moved through the grass. The town and its judgment still existed, but it was a world away. Inside the small cabin, a woman who was once lost had found what no gossip or preacher could ever offer, a place where love wasn't a transaction, but a fortress. A place where her name, spoken by a child and defended by a man, was finally and forever safe. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales from the heart of the Old West. And a question for the comments. If you were in Marble's shoes when the town came to save you, what would you have done? Let us know below.